All right, welcome back to another episode of Science of the Strike. My name is Corbin Healy, and I'm joined along with Sam Huckabee. Um, First of all, just want to give a plug to ourselves where you can find us. We are available on all of the places where you get your podcasts, whether that be Spotify or Apple. We also just launched our YouTube channel, so you can both listen and watch on YouTube at Science of the Strike. Before we get going, just got to give a quick plug to our two sponsors slash affiliates. First is going to be B3 Custom Rods. We've talked about our buddy Bo, who's making these custom rods. Sam and I have been fortunate enough to fish with some of the best stuff on the market, and we both feel very confident in saying that it goes toe to toe with the best that you can buy at a large producer level. Also, B3 might be in the near future pushing out some new custom baits, soft plastics. So be on the lookout. You can find them on Instagram at B3 Custom Rods. And next is our buddy Cade at Fishers of Men. He is doing custom paints on all things hard baits, glide baits, crankbaits, square bills, deep diving, jerk baits, top water, you name it, he's painting it. He'll customize anything you can do. I recently had a crankbait that I loved for years that I threw from Lucky Strike. They stopped making the pattern. I showed him a picture, and he pumped out 3 of them for me within just a few days. So go and check him out on both Instagram and Facebook at Fishers of Men. So episode 6, we are continuing our kind of internal little mini series here on prey. Part of being a great bass angler is understanding the prey. If you understand the prey, you'll understand the predator. I believe it was episode 4 that kicked off this mini series when we did an episode on crawdads or crawfish or wherever you're from, however you pronounce them. It's a great episode that is really informative about truly how underlooked I think crayfish or crawdads are throughout all 12 months of the year. And we're continuing that series today on shad. Now, because of where we're located here in Missouri, we're going to be focusing on threadfin and gizzard shad. We understand that there's other forage and other popular bait fish all throughout the country, but this is what's most applicable to us. So Sam's going to kick us off starting by just talking about the differences between threadfin and gizzard shad and getting a baseline understanding behind how those fish operate, where they live, how they live their lives in the water. And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about the implications of those shad species in our lakes and how bass react to them, and the science behind and the statistics behind how important they are to understand as anglers. So Sam, why don't you kick us off?
All right, guys. So I'm going to start with gizzard shad, but it's important to note that gizzard shad and threadfin shad are both part of the herring family. So that's where these bait fish kind of come from. That's their, ancestors. That herring family has come from a long ways, and now it's entered into the gizzard shad and threadfin shad. That are the two main forages for a lot of bass in the United States, Mexico, enter into Canada a little bit. So that's why we chose to talk about these two today. So to start, for gizzard shad, kind of just going to paint a picture for you here. They range from about 9 to 14 inches in length when they're full grown. Some have even been known to grow up to 20 inches. So just starting with that, it just goes to show like shad are not just these little baby bait fish that you're seeing, in the water and you're thinking that bass are going to eat. They actually are very large, and bass are, very opportunistic predators. And this is being one of their main forages. This is a big bait fish that they're eating on. So it's important for us to realize that, and, think about that when we're out fishing. So, a few things that make up the gizzard shad. Their coloration features, they're kind of silvery. Most of the bait fish seem to have like an underlying silver base, but these fish have more of a bluish, purplish back to them that kind of separate them from a lot of other shad. And we'll talk about threadfin later and how to distinguish them. But they have a very blunt snout. That's another way to tell them apart. They have usually a couple rays that run down the side of them. That's why you see many baits, have like a hard line going down the side of them. And that's kind of what they're trying to imitate. A lot of times these gizzard shad, when they have that hard black line going down the side of them. So it's good to know that too. A few other things. They have a row of sharp-edged spiny scales known as scutes along their belly midline. So that's also where that black or darker line can kind of come from. Right from that area is where they get a lot of that coloration from. So that's kind of good to know. Other things, the tail fin of the gizzard shad is not yellow. And that's a big distinction from a lot of other shad that you might be trying to identify when you're out fishing. You see them in the water. A darker tail usually goes along with a gizzard shad more than it does a threadfin shad or anything along those lines. Also, another thing that's really important to note, a gizzard shad does not have a black dot on it. Okay. Usually, when you see a shad, you pull it out of the water, or a fish ate a shad, you pull it out of the mouth. If you see a black dot, you can think more along the lines of it being a threadfin shad versus a gizzard shad.
I did not realize that.
Something that can be super easily looked over, if you're just pulling out a small little bait fish, like, oh, it's just a shad. But that could be an easy way to tell, because that black dot is super, bright and, out, you could see it very well if a fish had kind of like digested it partly. But that's still a way to be able to tell that. So that and the tail, coloration. So those are a few easy ways to kind of distinguish them apart. So now we're going to talk about kind of some internal anatomy about the gizzard shad. I'm going to talk all about gizzard shad here for a second, and then I'm going to, push over to threadfin shad. So they have a gizzard. It kind of fits their name, right? Just like a bird. So it's interesting, they can eat, and they have like little pebbles in their stomach that can help grind up their food, and then goes through their internal intestines, and so they can eat things a little bit more dense, and that's super important for like how they live their life, because when we talk about diet composition and things of that sort, that these bait fish feed on, it's important that they have that gizzard in their stomach. And then also they have, all their gill rakers, that allow them to filter things very, very well. In one of my articles I was reading, it said that sometimes their gill rakers can be remarkably high, exceeding over 400, which is incredibly high. If you look in a largemouth bass's gills, you can see the individual rakes, in there. But gizzard shad is just, there's so many of them, and they're stacked on top of each other. If you ever get a chance to look at a gizzard shad, I know they smell horribly and you don't ever want to touch them because they'll just stain everything in your boat. But if you get a chance to look at their gills, you'll be able to see how many there are in there. And that's partially because of how they feed. So what do the gizzard shad feed on? They focus mainly on an omnivorous diet. So they're going to kind of play in both categories here, somewhat like a largemouth bass eating a few smaller crustacean, insects, bugs, okay? Most of the time, you don't think about gizzard shad eating those types of things. You think of them eating, just the plankton, the phytoplankton, your decaying, dead organic material, that's on the bottom of the lake. And that's very true. They do primarily feed on that, but they can also feed on small insects and other like larvae and things like that they find in the water. So that's super important. And it's super important to note that since they are filter feeders, they are going to primarily spend a lot of their time eating on that dead, decaying material, and that is on the bottom of your lakes. So that can kind of point to where you're going to find your large portion of gizzards when they're not out running, around type of thing. So you think, you're just part of, throwing your large swim baits, you're throwing them across the mid-water column, might be good to, bounce them across the bottom every once in a while.
Sure.
When that's not, a normal, common, way to swim a swim bait, right?
Sure.
So just little things like that, thinking about as I was reading these, it was, kind of important to know, like how much of filter feeders they are and how much they feed on that bottom material. So
that's also like an interesting thought in my mind, because like using sonar, you'll see schools of fish, and like because in our lakes, like we have both,
right?
And I've oftentimes wondered, like based off of the size of the marks, like are those gizzards? Is that threadfin? Not that, I mean, I'd be curious to hear if you believe that knowing what you're around makes a difference in how you present. I'm sure it would, but
I would imagine.
seeing fish on the bottom might be a strong indicator, especially if you're seeing bigger marks, that those are just big gizzards.
Definitely, because they can be, 10 to even 20 inches. It's very easy for you to look out on live sonar
Oh,
and see a 2-foot fish and be like, that could be a 3-pound bass, or that could be a pound gizzard that's, this wide. The
I have
gizzards are just get
seen
so
gizzard
wide.
shad. Yes, I have seen gizzard shads follow. Like I was throwing like a 10-inch glide, and I thought like a 3-pound bass was following it, and I brought it all the way back to the boat, and it was a gizzard shad trying to spawn with it, and I was like, oh my god, it was the biggest shad I've ever seen in my life. It was crazy.
Right. And that just goes to show you, like those gizzards just get so, so big.
So big,
And
yeah,
that's what
so
the
big.
bass are feeding on. That's a big portion of what bass eat. Now, are they always eating the pound and a half gizzards?
Right,
No,
right.
no, but they do. So that's
Sure.
that's part of it. So talking a little bit about that, how they're feeding. One of my articles I looked up said, cutting into a large amount of gizzard shad, you will mainly find mud and sand in their stomach.
Wow.
So that is, primarily what they're eating on.
They're down on the bottom.
They're filtering out that water, and finding the little phytoplankton and crustaceans, within that sand and muddy bottom. So they're super important to, the ecosystem of a lot of these lakes, whether they're forage or, filtering the water and, helping keep it clean. So
Sure.
they're super, super vital to most lakes around the United States for sure. Okay. So talked a little bit about feeding mechanisms. The article made sure to note that they are, competition for other things like bluegill and threadfin shad. And oftentimes, they are the largest of the three. So they will usually, prevail because also we'll talk about a little later because of their spawn and how many eggs they can lay and everything that comes along with that. But they are the bigger of the three. They can filter a little, heavier stuff, eat a little more. So that made a very important note in that article that they're super big competition for other threadfin and even bluegill. So just with how they eat and how they kind of share similar diets of the sort.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about habitat of gizzard shad. So they're found in large rivers and reservoirs, less likely to be found in faster moving water. So more still lowland reservoirs, like your big Texas reservoirs and stuff like that are going to do well with them.
That's usually
the cleaner reservoirs down there in the south seem to have a better population of them. They seem to do better in less murky water. I think other things survive better in that, like a bluegill or craw, and they kind of predominate in a lot of those larger waters. But it spans all the way from the St. Lawrence River. So the smallmouth, largemouth up there, are feeding on your gizzards. And then it goes all the way, to California, all the way down to Mexico, back across the East Coast. So
wherever they're introduced.
Anywhere in the United States, it seems to be that gizzard shad have either, just populated there or they have been introduced to help the largemouth bass population grow. So they're very, very popular to put in any kind of lakes and rivers to help the ecosystem. So environmental factors that kind of affect the gizzard shad. This is super important for knowing like feeding patterns and time of when they become much easier to eat on for the largemouth bass. And if you've ever been out in the winter, you know exactly where I'm about to go with this. They have a certain temperature range that they can survive best in, and there's a certain temperature range where they die off very quickly, right? And that's why the jerkbait has become arguably the most popular bait to throw among a lot of the anglers around, every time but summer,
Sure.
So
sure.
It says that they can frequently live in temperatures ranging from 22 to 29 Celsius. But that also means that when you get down to that 40-degree temperature range for a lot of bodies of water, as you start to move north, Texas, it's a little harder for them to get down to that range. That's why they can populate so well in Texas.
Yep.
But you start to have those shad die-offs and stuff like that. So, and then you'll see, like, if you've ever walked around a frozen lake, you oftentimes can see, little white specks under the ice. Those are sometimes gizzard shad, threadfin shad, and stuff, things of that sort. So that is super important to know. Like, as you start to get colder, those shads start to move really, really slow and usually die off in large, large numbers. So that kind of helps them not overpopulate a lot of lakes. Or down in Texas, they can get so big and grow so much bigger than the gizzard shad around Missouri and lakes north of Missouri. So
right, yeah, a lot of people would be surprised. I think I'm sure some of our listeners have witnessed what you just described, but like it differs year to year, right? Depending on how cold it gets
very much
regionally. But like this past year in Missouri, like Ozarks, Table Rock, Truman had some of the biggest shad die-offs that we've ever seen. I mean, and I fished tournaments this early spring, and it made it incredibly difficult because all of these fish were stunned and were dead everywhere, and it was hard to present something that was more enticing than thousands of dead shad. So shad die-off is a real deal. It's a real deal.
Yeah. I just remember going on a run one day around, I think it was Raintree, and I mean, just littered down the shoreline. Like, you couldn't see a 10-foot space without a dead shad in it. So that this year definitely put a hurting on them big time, and affected the fishing, like you were saying, a big amount. So definitely plays a huge role, in the factors of early spring, late fall, winter fishing and stuff like that. So that's really important to keep in mind.
Keeping a pulse on the shad population.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about spawning. And this becomes one of the most, favorite times to fish of a lot of bass fishermen is that, late March, through early August, depending on where you are, probably with that 70-degree water temperature range, right? That's when things kind of start getting kicked off. It can get it kicked off a little bit sooner than that, but it doesn't seem like it ever happens too much sooner than that, depending on where you are. Obviously, time, length of day, time of the year it is. If you have a weird cold snap or something, it can affect that. But they do spawn around that time. And in Missouri, it seems to be from mid-April into June. And that's what we kind of determine as our shad spawn here. And that's when you can start pulling out those big baits, because those shad are just going crazy, up near the shallows. And that's when it becomes the best time to, potentially catch a big one. So if you're not catching them earlier in the year, but it's always an awesome time to get pledge crankbaits and do stuff like that. I'm sure you'll talk more about that a little later. But
and Sam, I'm not sure where you're going. Are you going to talk about like the low light and all that?
No, I'll let you talk about all that.
I was just going to say, just real briefly, to add on to the shad spawn. I mean, if we're going to talk about temperature wise, for whatever reason, shad like to spawn and oftentimes overnight into low light, and they also like to spawn on hard surfaces. So that's why you'll see a lot of guys spawning or throwing baits up against docks or up against sea walls really early in the morning. And oftentimes, as soon as the sun comes up, the shad are done spawning for the most part, and then that bite kind of dies off. But the first hour of a day is usually when guys can target, and that's not like groundbreaking information, but it is kind of part of that odd spawn season,
But that can also be why people have better luck in the mornings. You may just think, you go out and you're just like, oh, the morning bite seems to always be better. When you get towards that summertime, that's a
70
big
degrees,
play of it.
Yeah.
Right? That's a big part of it.
For sure.
So just keep that in mind, when you head out there. But so spawning wise, eggs and larvae type of thing, it says this is what I found quite interesting. Gizzard shad eggs typically hatch in 2 to 4 days. So it takes no time for them to repopulate, right?
my God, that's crazy.
So they can go through many spawning cycles,
Right.
right?
Oh, that
So that's
explains
how
so
they can be
much.
so many of them, and that's how you can have like a 5-inch gizzard pack running together and a 12-inch gizzard pack running together,
Yeah.
because they can spawn so fast and so many of them. Um, Sometimes they said that can range from 3 to 7 days. So within a week, once they put down those eggs, them eggs are hatched and they're out swimming. So it's like that's why the shad spawn can be so good, because they can just pump out so many spawning cycles in that
Uh-huh.
short phase of time. So it doesn't say amount of eggs on how much the gizzard shad, but it did say on the threadfin shad, and I'll talk about those numbers in a second here. And it's like astounding how many eggs that these little fish are pumping out.
I'm sure.
It doesn't give you it doesn't give you a strict number on how many hatch. I'm sure it's a thin number, of
Uh-huh.
what they actually put out there, but still, it's quite a crazy number. But it says that where they place these eggs and do their spawning is on hard surfaces, kind of like you're saying. And they made sure to mention like logs and stuff like that, because that's also where they can feed and get and filter feed in those areas. Harder, bigger rocks, things along that nature. Your seawalls, your man-made wall structures and stuff like that, that just get all that moss and stuff on them that they can really feed off of. So keep that in mind too. Lifespan of a um, gizzard shad is only about 3 to 4 years, and
Really? Okay.
and they reach maturity at about 2 years.
Okay.
So
Wow.
they're
That's fast.
pretty fast, and for
Super fast.
what you'd expect full grown shad, like 10, 12-inch gizzard shad, you would think that'd be a little older. At least I thought it would be a little older. But it
I
said that
definitely did.
they can live to up to 10 years. So that's a long lifespan for a gizzard shad. Usually they don't live that long, right? And
I get eaten.
get eaten, or depends on if you have the food availability and
Uh,
all those different things. But I will say within the first year, when they're growing, depending on their food and growing seasons, it said young gizzard shad can reach 10 to 18 centimeters within their first year. So, growing, there shows that they're growing really, really fast,
very
and then they
rapidly. Yeah.
kind of like just tail off right at 2 years, and they just become that mature, gizzard shad. So let's talk a little bit about threadfin shad, and then we'll pass it over to Corbin here. So just a few major differences. Threadfin shad have yellow tail. Threadfin shad have a black dot on their side. Threadfin shad usually only grow up to about 4 to 5 inches.
Sure.
Um,
I've seen some big threadfin shad though. Like I've seen probably 6, 7, 8 inch
yeah, and that's not
threadfins.
saying you can't have an outlier
Freaks.
of
Yeah.
any kind, but yeah. So they have that. They have their lateral lines and also do threadfin shad, as we kind of talked about in previous episodes. So it's good to keep that in mind. That they feel similar, like vibrations as a largemouth bass does. So that allows them to get away from predators and stuff like that. Um, Internal anatomy is very similar to a gizzard shad. They said there's no real differences there. Diet composition, pretty consistent with the gizzard shad, except for they will even eat on small fish fry. They're a little bit more omnivorous, like more towards
Really?
the eating the meat, eating the crustaceans, than a gizzard shad, even because they tend to spend a lot of their time in the middle of the water column, where gizzard shad will spend more of their time on the
Right.
bottom.
Right.
So
Right. Right. And that's
that
what I've
can
seen. Yeah.
help you kind of identify, or if you see a smaller little pack of bait fish, you can maybe pinpoint it
Maybe have a
more
better
on
idea.
a threadfin rather than the gizzard shad, even if the gizzard shad can be the same length at any given time. Just keep that in mind. You might find them a little higher in the water column than you would a gizzard shad. So I found that kind of interesting. They're still going to eat on their plankton and things of that nature. So they will still feed on the bottom and they will filter feed, but they spend a little more of their time up in the water. So When I looked up, preferred habitats for the threadfin shad, it said that they rarely will go deeper than 18 meters, which is, you can kind of convert that to somewhere around 50 feet. So they do like to stay fairly shallow. It says they normally will reside in the upper 5 feet of the water column.
Okay, yeah,
So that's, your top water bites, things of that nature. You might be playing into a little bit more of the threadfin shad, busting on top, getting away, and things of that nature, rather than
yes,
big gizzard shads along with, that. Not saying gizzard shad won't get up real shallow, especially when they're spawning and stuff like that. You
spawning,
catch
yeah,
them
yeah,
and on that nature, but it's usually more of the threadfin shad. So, maybe when you're going out to buying baits, or you're having Cade paint you a bait or whatever it is, you're trying to throw a, top water spook, walking the dog, whatever it is, you might get a threadfin shad pattern,
sure,
see if that
sure.
makes a difference. Um, let's see here. It says during spring and fall, large numbers of threadfin shad congregate around the dam. I didn't really understand why that was. Maybe that's their filter feeding around that area, but it did say that was a common movement for them. Spring and fall wise, they can be in brackish water environments, even like lagoons and stuff like that. So they can tolerate a little bit more, I think, than sometimes threadfin shad may be able to, of like what kind of water they're in.
The threadfin shad you're saying can tolerate more than gizzard shad? Is that what you're saying,
Well, it said
or
when
the other way around?
they're both pretty tolerable, like they can do that, but it said threadfin shad can be in more brackish water even
Okay,
sometimes,
okay,
so
okay,
like even that kind of salt water a little bit.
sure, sure.
I think threadfin may have that ability too, but it made sure to note that threadfin shad really could. So you know it just shows like how tough that these little shad are, and their ability to live in all these different kinds of environments, all the way from California across, up into the north, all the way up to the St. Lawrence River and things of that nature. So, um, it says, so going into that, like geographic distribution all over Missouri, California, Arizona, Atlantic states, Hawaii, Asia, Europe. So these threadfin shad are even getting over, across the ocean.
Sure,
So
everywhere.
yeah, so threadfin shad are like probably one of the most populated shad populations for most largemouth bass fisheries, if you're going to have a shad population. So just keep that in mind. Um, it says environmental factors. Threadfin shad are really sensitive to low temperatures. They often start dying off at 45 degrees, which is quite
Even,
high,
yeah, that's
you
very
know,
high.
compared to what I thought it would be. I thought you'd have to see those mid 30s before you're almost getting that ice, getting close to that for them to really start dying off. But no, it said 45, and it can also
Oh, that
it said in some Missouri lakes survival appears to be dependent on the continuous discharge of warm water from like running the dam, or sometimes they're in power plants,
right.
lakes, or things of that nature, just for them to be able to stay alive.
Well,
So
I mean that makes sense. You always hear like in the fall, right? That a
yeah,
lot of times the bait will start moving back into trying to find the warmest water, and that makes sense. It also makes me think like, man, I usually, you know, contemplate when the time is right to pull up jerk bait, right? Well, it sounds
yeah,
like, I mean, water temp hits 50, I feel like, and that would be a fine time to start, as you work down, 50 and below, because usually I might reserve that jerk bait for like 45, but there's always going to be that early group that might start getting stunned on the first cold front,
yeah, that's exactly right. That first cold front, it could be mid 50s, or you get on one that drops way low overnight. You could put them in a
Yeah,
stun or whatever, and
especially fish that are shallow.
have bass eating them. So that's important to know. Spawning, really the only thing I wanted to mention was spawning. They spawn around that same temperature, 70 degrees.
That's what I was
So
going to ask. Is that right? Okay.
yeah, yeah. So they're both shad species are fighting over that hard structure and are going to town producing those eggs. It says that threadfin shad usually hatch in about 3 days, and that they can produce up to 24,000 eggs
Jeez.
in one spawn cycle. So that's incredible. It says a 4-inch female can produce up to 12,400 eggs, and a 6-inch female can produce up to 24,000 eggs.
Okay,
So that's
that's
incredible, right? And not that all of them
insane.
are going to hatch by
Right,
any
right,
means,
right.
but a large portion of them will, and they will survive. And that's why you see those massive shad balls when you go out
Sure,
fishing on
sure.
any, well taken care of lake. So, um, it says that few individuals live beyond 2 to 3 years for threadfin. So they have a little shorter lifespan.
On
They're a little
average.
smaller bait fish, right? It might be because they're more easily eaten, in that sense, but I think it's also just their typical lifespan. Um, some they said to note that some threadfin and bull shoals have been found to live up to 4 years. So 4 years seems like the max that they'll live. Um, let's see, anything else I wanted to say here? Just a few things. Fin color. Keep in mind, threadfin shad have a yellow tint in all of their fins except for their dorsal fin on their back. Distinguishing that, and we'll drop this chart in there if we can for you guys that kind of show the differences and just the main things about gizzard and threadfin to help you kind of distinguish them. But the distinguishing marks on a gizzard shad's blunt nose, no black chin or mouth speckles. Sometimes you can find that on threadfin and other species. You're going to have more of that silvery, darker top to them. So, yeah, that's basically it. They can live a little longer. They'll spawn a little, gizzard shad will spawn a little longer into the summer. So that might be important to note. If you're going out a little later in the summer after the spawn, you think maybe over, maybe target a little big gizzard shad instead of that threadfin shad if you're trying to hit the spawn.
Sure.
So, yeah, pass it over to you.
Yeah, that last part there is pretty interesting, and what it tells me is just like if you're someone who really cares about matching the hatch, which if you fish in a super clear water fishery, it might be more important than
Yeah.
other folks who don't live in a clear water on a clear water fishery. That you hear so many people just say, "Oh, that's a shad pattern," which it is, but like if you really want to get down to the nitty gritty, there actually are some pretty distinguishable features between gizzard shad and threadfin shad that
Right.
might be worth looking into your body of water to make sure, hey, what do I have? And make sure that,
Yeah.
if you really want to get super dialed in, that's a great way to do it, and make sure that if let's say, your lake only has threadfin shad rather than gizzard, which sounds like it, if a lake is going to have one, that threadfin might be more common, more commonplace. They often
Yeah. Yeah.
co-populate lakes, but having a Sharpie in the boat, having a black marker for your soft plastics to be able to make a dot, having something that the fish can hone in on. I know that Sam and I both. I mean, I carry a black marker in the front of my boat, and a lot of times I'll be marking plastic baits, for that big dot, or go check out episode 1 when we talk about color and vision with chartreuse and everything like that. It's worth a listen, especially as it relates to the brightness of a bait. And it does make a
Right.
difference between
Right.
like a gizzard color that wouldn't have that would be a black top versus
A
having
little
that
more of
that
a
brighter
yellow
stripe,
or yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Exactly right.
interesting thing.
I
So
think, and then one more thing. It's just like that. The thing where I found out that the threadfin are gonna populate the 5 foot range and less was like super. Like I've never heard that. I've never known. Like up in that shallow. Like that's huge. And I think about some of the spooks that I throw. Like they are threadfin pattern, have that, yellower streak down the side of them,
right,
wider
right.
belly, I don't know how much of a difference that makes, but it could, and
Well, what it tells me is that like when you start throwing shad style baits beyond like 10 feet,
yeah, you
you're
start
you're you're
cranking.
actually you're actually more in a way imitating, it sounds like like gizzards.
Right,
You might
right.
not be exclusively, trying to imitate a gizzard shad, but the odds are that behavioral wise, you're you're more closely mimicking the behavior of a gizzard shad, being down deeper, which
Yeah.
is so interesting because then you start, I mean, for the guys that are crazy in the head like us, get ticky tacky about, I'm going to throw a threadfin presentation from 0 to 10, and from 10 to 30, I'm going to throw a gizzard shad. It
Yeah.
makes me feel, if I'm throwing a really big bait, like feeling more comfortable about, hey, let's drag this on the bottom, which obviously is not a new thing, but
Right.
it's just confidence thing, understanding how these fish behave, I think makes you feel more confident about trying things that you maybe hadn't in the past. So,
Yeah.
as I get into what I want to talk about, I want to like challenge the listener to like recall two things that Sam said, or to hold on to two things that Sam said, which is the timing of the spawn and also the amount of eggs that these fish lay. Because the 3 or 4 studies that I looked at, I mean, I looked at more than that, but the ones I'm going to be talking about today um, talk a lot about like bass size correlation with shad consumption, and understanding that in certain times of the year there's going to be a greater presence of smaller shad is really critical to understanding why certain times of the year smaller bass might be associated with eating more shad than larger bass. So like in our lakes right now, a great example is like, I can't like this is going to sound crazy, but like with where we live, like if I go out and throw like a lipless crankbait, I will struggle to get a bite on a full size lipless crankbait because those fish are so keened in on this super small fry from this recent shad spawn. And
Spawn.
you can
Yeah.
see the early morning busting on the top of the water. A lot of time it's with that the shad that just hatched, in these, back in
June
April, May,
even.
June,
Yeah.
So that's just kind of something to think about.
Yeah.
So the way I'm gonna do this is like kind of go article by article. And so the first article I'm going to be talking about is one that actually I mentioned in our episode 4 about crawfish. And it's funny because this article actually deals on shad, like its focus was on gizzard shad, but there was some interesting information about crawfish in it. So the title of this article is Disentangling the Ecological Role of Gizzard Shad in Kansas Small Impoundment Food Webs, Changes in Limnology, Fish Communities, and Predator Diets After Ritone Manipulation, or I'm not sure if I'm saying that word right, ritone. It's a chemical, putting a chemical in the water. And this was written by Elizabeth Renner. This is a 126-page dissertation that she wrote for the Division of Biology at K-State University in 2022. So she really knows what she's talking about. And so she was essentially testing the influence that gizzard shad had on these ecosystems, these lakes in Kansas, of 12 separate impoundments over the course of 4 years. So very holistic study. And I think throughout the process of understanding how the shad behaved and how bass behavior intersected with bass behavior, they dissected like around 1,500 bass stomachs, or checked the
Wow.
contents of around 1,500 bass stomachs. So in her study, she explains that like prior to her study, and even still today, that the impact of shad abundance in a lake on largemouth bass diet composition is poorly understood. So, in other words, like understanding the correlation between a very significant presence of shad and bass health is poorly understood. And in her dissertation, chapter 4, if you want to go read it, this is where she specifically looks at the largemouth diets. And she wanted to know essentially if bass were selectively preying on gizzard shad compared to other forage, and most importantly, compared to other fish forage. All right.
Right.
So before she started her test, she formed a hypothesis like any good test. And her hypothesis was that as gizzard shad abundance increased, so would the frequency of fish in those bass diets, and that shad would be the preferred meal.
That
So
makes sense.
if there was more shad, there would be more shad consumption by bass.
Right.
Interesting results. The data showed that the frequency of occurrence in fish in largemouth bass diets was not associated with gizzard shad relative abundance. So let's think about that for a second, all right? So we often target areas where we see shad, where we think shad might be, assuming that our bass are gorging on them. How many times have we been out on the water and we've been in a huge presence of bait and we cannot get a bite, right? But the study, at least here in the Midwest, suggests that at least in these 12 Kansas impoundments, shad might not be the primary protein source for largemouth. Okay. So I think the natural follow-up question that someone might have after hearing that is like, well, what are they eating? Right. Because that's what we care about. And the study found that the largemouth bass diets were dominated first by fish. Okay. And that's including all fish. That's shad, bluegill, other largemouth, any other type of minnow in the water. Then it was aquatic macroinvertebrates. So think bugs and larvae and stuff like that. And then crayfish. And when it came to fish, bluegill cannibalism on smaller bass and other fish like sunfish were more frequent in the bass diets than gizzard shad. Okay.
Really?
In fact, gizzard shad actually made up a pretty minor component of the overall diet. Now,
I wonder if that's due to size.
One thing to think about with all this throughout all of these studies is that everything that I read says the same thing, which is that gizzard shad and threadfin shad, because of their anatomy, tend to dissolve in a bass's stomach faster than other animals would or will. And so oftentimes these biologists would look at stomach contents and they'd say, this is a fish, but it is an unidentifiable fish. Whereas they could maybe look at a bluegill and go, we know that this is a bluegill. We know that this is a crawdad. We know that this is a salamander or a frog or whatever.
Sure.
And so they would obviously count a shad when they knew it was a shad, but there is oftentimes in all these studies a broad category just marked as like unidentifiable fish. And depending on how you substitute in these unidentifiable fish as shad, like just if you assume that they're shad, can kind of change the data a little bit, but not so significantly that I think it really changes so much what these results are. So I want to talk a little bit in Miss Renner's article about bass size, right? So in her study, and I'm going to read you something later that is to the contrary, in her study, bass length played a significant role in what they ate, right? So the size of the bass played a significant role. Intermediate size bass, which that she classified as anything between 5 and 10 inches, had the highest frequency of fish in their diet. Okay. And which makes sense because growing fish need the most highly caloric diet. And the studies, not this one, but another one I read, talk about how shad are the most caloric thing that bass can eat. But what is interesting and kind of a surprise, and we talked about this in episode 4, is that those larger bass, the ones that were 10 inches and over, their diets were dominated primarily by crawfish and compared to other fish, which
I remember that
is interesting. Now, I'll address that a little bit later, but another part that is interesting is part of her research involved like manipulating gizzard shad populations in these different lakes using this chemical. I don't remember what it was called. It was some type of chemical that she would put in the water that would essentially be like a selective shad removal. She could like kill a certain group of shad in different areas and in these different lakes, right? And the idea was to see how removing those shad would impact the ecosystem in any way, shape, or form, including bass. And again, she made a hypothesis before she did this, and her hypothesis was that if shad were in fact a crucial food source to bass, that their removal would lead to a decline in fish eating, specifically shad, by the largemouth bass due to this reduced prey availability, right? And in sync with her earlier results, these results showed that gizzard shad eradication did not alter the frequency of fish in largemouth bass's diet. So this
Wow.
further supports the finding that this, and this idea that gizzard shad might not be as critical to largemouth bass diets in these specific impoundments, right, as previously thought. And it also suggests that bass are adaptable and can switch to other, like you said, they're opportunistic feeders,
Right, right, right.
more readily available prey to them, like bluegill, like other minnows, or like crawfish. Now, it's important to note that the language of what I just read from her article, which is that the gizzard shad eradication did not alter the frequency of fish in largemouth bass diets. Now, there's a table here that I'm going to try to put in that shows that even throughout these tests, the number one thing that these largemouth bass were eating were fish. Okay. Now, there's not a subcategory in this chart that breaks down fish from gizzard shad, but it tells us that even when shad are eradicated, they're still choosing fish 34% of the time.
Is that
Okay. And the
threadfin?
next one, I don't know if it's threadfin. I don't know. Her article didn't address that, but I didn't read anything about the presence of threadfin in these impoundments that she tested. But there was a presence of bluegill,
Bluegill.
right?
Yeah.
Which we will be doing a sub episode on in this miniseries. So it went 34%, fish in their diets, 31% aquatic macroinvertebrates, and then 19% at crayfish, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just going to read a really brief actual language from her article that I just think kind of encapsulates everything that I've just said, which is pretty interesting. Over 4 years and 135 sampling events, sorry, I got my number wrong, 2,715 largemouth bass stomach samples were collected and analyzed. Largemouth bass consumption across all length classes and all months was dominated by fish, then aquatic macroinvertebrates, and then crayfish. Out of all stomach samples collected, 34% contained fish, 32% contain aquatic macroinvertebrates, 19% contain crayfish, and then 26% were empty. Now, this is getting more into the size. Juvenile bass, less than 150 milliliters total length, primarily consumed macroinvertebrates. We talked about this, and fish. While diet composition of intermediate length bass was dominated by fish, crayfish, and macroinvertebrate matter. Adult bass greater than 250 millimeters total length consumed crayfish 38%, fish 32%, and macroinvertebrates 11%. So largemouth bass prey largely consisted of bluegill, cannibalism of smaller bass, and other sunfish type fish, and then gizzard shad. So really, really interesting study that talks about, again, I really would challenge the listener to go listen to episode 4 because we talk about
Yeah.
crawdads and crawfish with this, but that tells me a lot about, Midwest gizzard shad and crawfish interaction in terms of bass. So the next
Just a
article,
note, real
yeah,
fast. 250 millimeters is 10 inches. So that's
right,
what they're
right, right,
calling an adult bass.
yes.
So
So
that's still significantly,
very
short
small,
in length of tournament
yes,
fishing or anything like that. But that's kind of gives you
100%.
idea of what they're looking to eat, eventually as they're
100%.
growing. So
Yes. And with that, and I don't know if I'm going to get into this tonight, but there was an article that I read that was incredibly interesting because I was concerned about exactly what you just said. I was thinking, well, a lot of these studies are testing small impoundments throughout the country in Kansas and
mhm.
Alabama. And I want to know what is going on with the diets of trophy largemouth. Okay. And I read an article that discussed this and talked about the stomach contents of some of these of the largest bass in over 25 inches, right? In Grand Lake, I think it was Grand Lake in like Fort Worth, Texas, right? And I'll see if I can't
Grand
Fine.
Lakes in Oklahoma.
No, okay, then I'm thinking of, I can't remember what. Yeah,
It's got to be Texas. Texas always got the bigger
it's
bass.
a
Seems
Texas
like.
lake. Um, I highlighted a bunch of this information. I yeah. Well, I won't take the time to look
Yeah.
for it. I think that it might be called yeah. So if you want to go and read it yourself, it's an article by this guy named Jason Briegman out of the South Dakota State University. The title of his study is called "The Ecology of Largemouth Bass and Angling Reservoir: Implications for Creating a Trophy Largemouth Bass Fishery." And what he, long story short, is that shad is an important piece to the puzzle for growing trophy largemouth bass. I'll discuss that when I get into this next article, but um, uh, of the largest bass in this lake that they studied, which was, I can't remember the name of the lake, big lake in Texas, the bass that were the largest bass that they tested, it was like the stomach contents was like, it was like a bluegill, it was a salamander, it was a frog, and then one had shad in it. And they only tested, like, that I read was like 5 or 6 of these truly trophies, because they just did like the whatever you call it, putting electricity in
Yeah.
the water to make them float.
Yeah.
And so they only classified, like 5 or 6 of these like truly behemoths, and then only one of their stomach was gizzard shad. Now, I don't think that's necessarily dispositive of the issue, but um,
Yeah.
the next article that I really dove into was titled "Evaluating the Potential for Predatory Control of Gizzard Shad by Largemouth Bass and Small Impoundments: A Bioengenetics Approach" by Brian Irwin, Dennis R. Veris, and Russell Wright. This study was published in 2003 and comes from Auburn University. So we know from Elizabeth Renner's research in Kansas, suggests that gizzard shad might not be as dominant in bass's diet as we sometimes assume. But this paper by Irwin looks at the same question. Okay, but now we're in the Southeast. All right. And in his study, he researched or sampled over 1,300 largemouth bass stomachs in 4 ponds, okay,
Okay.
in Alabama over 2 years, 1998 and 1999. And here's what they found about bass diets in these Alabama waters. So similar to the Kansas study, their analysis identified 6 main prey categories, which were, crayfish, aquatic
Yeah.
invertebrates, sunfish like bluegill, other largemouth bass, gizzard shad, and then this unidentifiable fish. Okay.
Right.
Big largemouth bass. So those 350 millimeters, which is about 18 or 13.8 inches and larger, consumed the greatest biomass of gizzard shad. And they were eating shad throughout the entirety of the year. Okay. So this is contrary to what we read with Elizabeth Renner's article. Okay.
Yeah.
And their study, this guy's study, Irwin's study, found that smaller bass under 350 millimeters had more gizzard shad in their stomachs in the late summer and early fall compared
There
to
you
the
go.
winter and early spring, which makes perfect sense with the
Yeah.
shad
Sure
lineup, or
does.
with the spawn lineup and the stun that
Yeah.
happens in cold water. And so the question that you might be asking yourself is like, well, what's the difference, right? Why are we seeing that in one study here in Kansas, it's saying that the
Gizzard shad
larger,
is not as important. Right.
right, whereas it is in the South. And they actually, the language of the Irwin study addresses this. And the exact quote is that in Southeast U.S. systems, some prey fishes, such as sunfishes or gizzard shad, can produce tremendous amounts of larvae. Because these systems were relatively small and shallow, their habitat structure may be advantageous to the foraging capabilities of largemouth bass. Therefore, age 0 gizzard shad may not enjoy the spatial refuge from predators that is more typical of natural lakes or reservoirs with greater open water areas. So, in
Yeah.
other words, this is kind of twofold. In southern climates, gizzard shad are going to have a longer spawning period, and they're going to have faster growth rates, and they're not going to have this stunning period where there are these massive die-offs.
Right. That's
Which
the huge part.
leads, yeah, huge part, which leads to a more consistent supply of vulnerable, smaller younger shad throughout a longer period of time. All
That makes
right.
sense.
And this could make them, a more reliable and abundant food source for largemouth bass throughout the entirety of the year, right? Um, the thing you have to think about is really where you're at. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
here in the Midwest, we are in a significantly more temperate climate than in the Southeast. Now, while gizzard shad are present, okay, their population dynamics, like their spawn time, their growth rates, their die-offs, their overall abundance, are significantly different, and they're significantly shorter than down in the Southeast. So that was kind of the explanation that was given and that I understood took away from why shad might not be, or specifically gizzard shad in these studies,
Yeah.
might not be as big of a diet in Midwestern fish compared to these big shad eating Southern F1
Yeah.
strain
F1.
bass, like seriously.
Really.
Okay. And then the last part of this last article, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but I think it's worth mentioning because it does engage threadfin shad. It was titled Evaluating the Effects of Threadfin Shad on Largemouth Bass and Bluegill Populations in Small Impoundments by Sean Christopher Lusk, which was a thesis that was submitted to the Graduate Facility of Auburn in fulfillment for his Master's of Science. And this was in May of 2016. So without getting into the nitty gritty of this very detailed thesis, the big picture result is that this study suggests that threadfin shad increase the initial growth of largemouth bass, but do not have a significant impact on largemouth bass condition overall. So largemouth bass and impoundments recently, and this was what was interesting. He talked about like the lifetime of the lake that he was testing. If it was like a relatively new impoundment versus a
Okay.
long-standing natural made lake.
Yeah. It's important.
Largemouth bass and impoundments recently established fed primarily on threadfin shad, whereas largemouth in established impoundments fed primarily on bluegill and only supplemented their diets with threadfin shad. Kind of interesting, right? And
Yeah.
there's some
That's
charts
huge.
that demonstrate the diets and the breakdowns between bluegill and threadfin and craw and macroinvertebrates, and the same thing that we've been talking about this whole time. But the takeaway from everything that I read is largely about where you're at. And I think that at the end of the day, like if you're an avid angler like us, that kind of makes sense. Like when you think about like the northern guys,
Sure.
like
Sure.
they're not going after massive gizzard, trying to imitate big massive gizzard shad. They're not trying to focus on shad near as much as the guys down south. Down south, you've got guys throwing massive glide baits 12 months out of the year trying to get a bite on a gizzard shad pattern because they can. Where
Yeah.
Sam and I are kind of in a unique position being in the Midwest, we kind of get a little bit of the best of both worlds, right? Like we still
Yeah.
have a healthy shad spawn in I would say, a pretty healthy shad population, but we also have a very significant shad die-off that is directly correlative to the shifting of a bass's diet onto things like crawfish or macroinvertebrates, which is directly what is shown in studies like Elizabeth Renner's or even Irwin's.
Yeah.
So it again emphasizes to me that you know you have to be willing to put down the crankbait if you need to put down the crankbait and pick up the jig,
Mm-hmm.
because crawdads, are going to be available food source throughout all 12 months of the year, right?
Right. Right.
Here they are, right?
Yeah.
Whereas shad, while their presence is still always going to be in the lake, are not going to be as active as places that have those warmer conditions, and that obviously
Yeah.
is supported by the science that Sam discussed with those
Yeah.
fish.
I think this also speaks to like the importance of bluegill and how
Oh man,
I
totally
throw
agree.
bluegill like to the side a lot, just basic baits, you're wanting to
Yes,
imitate a plastic, craw, whatever,
yes,
lizard, or you're throwing a moving bait and you're trying to imitate a shad. But
Yes.
bluegill is so often just left off the table for some reason in a
Could not
lot
agree more.
of, the baits, but like like a lot of people are figuring out, like the gilly, or what's that other bait
The
from
Gantarelle,
the
Jackal
yeah,
Gantarelle. Yeah.
Gantrell, or what's that other bait the other day that I was throwing that people are starting to make, the rib baits from Japan. G
Oh, well,
crack,
that's what Bo's gonna
the
the
bellows
G
gill.
Bellows Gill. Well, hey, hit up
Right.
B3 Custom because he's starting to make his own Bellows Gill
Right,
type
but
bait.
that's
So,
why people are having, I think so much success on those, because it's, just such
oh,
overlooked bait, and
I
like
don't know why it is.
imitation
And
style.
I've listened to guys on YouTube. I've listened to pros talk about this that it is so overlooked, and I totally agree. I am so fast to like. I'm not going to pick
Right.
up a bluegill square bill. Like
Right.
I'm gonna
Right.
pick up a shad square bill,
Right.
or I'm not gonna pick up a bluegill like chatterbait before I pick up like some type of shad chatterbait, which
Right.
is
Just
just like
black and white,
totally
right? Yeah,
totally
or white.
backwards. Especially when you're looking at studies like the one that I cited, looking at the biggest bass in the country that at least in like the South, I can't speak for like
Yeah.
out west, like trout eaters, right? But like
Right.
having gills in their stomach, So we're definitely going to do an episode dedicated on the bluegill species here
Yeah.
in the
It's gonna be
Midwest,
good.
and I that will be a really big one, and I'm sure that will impact the way that I view this and stop putting bluegill to the side.
Yeah. Very much so.
Alrighty, well that rounds us
Yeah.
out right at about an hour. A little bit of a longer episode for us, but thanks for tuning in. As you can see, Sam and I have decided to go digital because, as you know, we just have super busy schedules, and doing this while we're not in person together, it will promote a more frequent schedule for us putting out
Yeah.
content. So we're trying to get on a pretty regular schedule. So. Be on the lookout for episodes 6 getting published here soon. And I guess if you're listening to this is episode 6, and then episode 7 will hopefully be coming up soon. The other thing that before we go, I just want to tell people, if people out there listening to this, if you have some type of topic that you want to hear a scientific approach on, or that you've
Yeah.
always wondered, please reach out to us. Reach out to us on Instagram, Science of the Strike. Just message us. Message us on YouTube. Also, if you're someone who maybe wants to be affiliated with us, we've got B3 Customs and we've got Fishers of Men who, we've got a great partnership with them. If that's something that you're interested in, just like getting if you're making your own baits or something like that, hit us up. We'd love to chat with you and see what you have in mind. So thanks so much for
Yeah.
listening, and we'll
Awesome.
catch you on the next one.
Later.